He's addressing this issue of the ceasefire in Israel.
In Israel and Gaza. Mothers and fathers shattered by the ultimate grief. The innocent dead. Israeli, Palestinian, Muslim, Jew. It's a tragedy where the facts on the ground are changing by the minute, but where the consequences will last for decades, and the trauma might never fade. A crisis where the search for solutions is shrouded not just by the fog of war, but by an ever-darkening cloud of misinformation. But nonetheless, we must do what we can, and we must explain what we do. Democratic accountability matters, particularly in light of the rising temperature on British streets. Our efforts must respond to the two immediate tragedies. To the 7th of October, the biggest slaughter of Jews, and that is why they were killed, do not doubt that, since the Holocaust. Men, women, children, babies, murdered, mutilated, and tortured by the terrorists of Hamas. Over 200 hostages, including British citizens, taken back into Gaza. Make no mistake, this is terrorism on a scale and brutality that few countries have ever experienced. Certainly not this one. And that is an immutable fact that must drive our response to these events. As must the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, which again plays out on a previously unimaginable scale. Thousands of innocent Palestinians dead, displaced, desperate for food and water, reduced to drinking contaminated filth, hiding out in hospitals for shelter, whilst in those same buildings, babies lie in incubators that could turn off at any moment. At every stage during this crisis, my approach has been driven by the need to respond to both these tragedies, to stand by the right to self-defense of any nation which suffers terrorism on this scale, alongside the basic human rights of innocent Palestinians caught once again in the crossfire. To focus at every stage on the practical steps that might make a material difference on the ground. In the short term, on the humanitarian conditions in Gaza and the efforts by Israel to rescue her hostages. But in the future, also to the hope that I know still burns brightly for those who want peace. The two-state solution. An Israel where every citizen enjoys the security they need, and a viable Palestinian state, where the Palestinian people and their children enjoy the freedoms and opportunities that we all take for granted. And that is why, while I understand calls for a ceasefire at this stage, I do not believe that it is the correct position now, for two reasons. One, because a ceasefire always freezes any conflict in the state where it currently lies. And as we speak, that would leave Hamas with the infrastructure and the capability to carry out the sort of attack we saw on October the 7th. Attacks that are still ongoing. Hostages who should be released still held. Hamas would be emboldened and start preparing for future violence immediately. And it is this context which explains my second reason, which is that our current calls for pauses in the fighting for clear and specific humanitarian purposes, and which must start immediately, is right in practice as well as principle. In fact, it is at this moment the only credible approach that has any chance of achieving what we all want to see in Gaza: the urgent alleviation of Palestinian suffering, aid distributed quickly, space to get hostages out. That is why is also the position shared by our major allies in the US and the EU. And I urge all parties to heed its call. Over time, the facts on the ground will inevitably change in relation to both hostages being rescued and Hamas's capability to carry out attacks like we saw on October the 7th. And we must move to cessation of fighting as quickly as possible. Because the reality is that neither the long-term security of Israel nor long-term justice for Palestine can be delivered by bombs and bullets. Open-ended military action, action without a clear and desired political outcome, is ultimately futile. This needs to begin now, because a political agreement, however unlikely that seems today, however painful the first steps are to take, is the only way to resolve this conflict once and for all. That is why our position and our counsel has always been that Israel must submit to the rules of international law. The right to self-defense is fundamental, but it's not a blank check. The supply of basic utilities like water, medicines, electricity, and yes, fuel to civilians in Gaza cannot be blocked by Israel. Every life matters, so every step must be taken to protect civilians from bombardment. Palestinians should not be forced to leave their homes en masse. But where they have no choice but to flee within Gaza, we need crystal clear guarantees that they will be able to return quickly. You cannot overstate the importance of this last point. In conflicts like this, the most painful blows are those that land on the bruises of history. And for Palestinians, the threat of displacement sends a shiver down the spine. It must be disavowed urgently, clearly, and by all. Because while it may feel like a truism, so often the trauma of the present leads directly to the tragedy of the future. Hamas know this. They knew Israel would have to respond. Their aim on October the 7th was not just to kill Jews. It was to bring death upon their fellow Muslims in Gaza. A plan written in blood to isolate Israel from the West, destroy its improving relations with other Arab nations, and ultimately provoke wider regional conflicts across the Middle East.
Well, we're going to go immediately now. That's Labour leader Keir Starmer speaking at Chatham House. We're going to go to Mark White, who is our Home Security editor, who's in Tel Aviv, for some reaction. Mark, you've heard the Labour leader. He's not changing his position one dot. No to a ceasefire.
No, indeed, and really reiterating why a humanitarian pause is absolutely what is needed, and needed as a matter of urgency. As for a ceasefire, he said clearly, a ceasefire would leave both parties at the current state. It would freeze, with effectively Hamas still left with the capability to launch those attacks that we are seeing still on a daily basis, with more rockets coming across today. It would leave Hamas with that capability. Not just that, according to Keir Starmer, it would embolden Hamas to go on and to carry out other attacks in the future. So there has to be the ability of Israel to defend itself, to go forward and clearly achieve its stated goal of destroying Hamas. But in doing that, he says that the people of Palestine, the civilians who are suffering, must be a top priority for the Israeli government there. And one issue is, of course, the humanitarian pauses to allow aid trucks in to help the people, and we're hearing today that as many as 80 aid trucks may be heading into Gaza itself. 40, I think, have already been checked by border officials before moving across the border. That they are hoping to do more frequently and in greater numbers. That would certainly help alleviate the situation as well. But another interesting point I think he made there was the issue about the forced movement of people, and of course this whole issue, he said, sends a shiver down the spine of Palestinians. And there needs to be, as a matter of urgency, a guarantee from the Israelis that there would be moves to get people back in to their communities again after the cessation of hostilities, wherever that might be, that there should not be the permanent forced removal of the Palestinian people from the Gaza Strip. So very interesting from Keir Starmer. It really echoes the line and the stance that is being taken by the British government, and as he said in his speech there, Andrew, also the allies of Israel, such as the US and France.
All right, that's Mark White, who's our correspondent in Tel Aviv. But a big moment for Labour, because Keir Starmer has not backed down a jot.
No.
He's already had 13 front benchers criticising his position. I think we could well now see possibly resignations. That would be my prediction.